Hello, lots of familiar names, which is really great to see. Students past and present, so lovely to have you with us. My name, for those that don't know me, is Jackie Bagnall, and I'm the Programme Director of the MBA. We'd like to extend a very warm welcome to the Leading Edge 2021, a speaker series brought to you from the Exeter MBA at the University of Exeter Business School. A business school with leading research centres in entrepreneurship, circular economy, sustainable finance, simulation, analytics and modelling, and index initiatives in the digital economy. It's also home to Exeter's Centre for Leadership, whose members conduct distinctive and high-quality research in leadership and governance. The Centre for Leadership offers programmes at undergraduate, postgraduate, and executive MBA levels. Welcome. I'm delighted to introduce you to Ciara Eastle, a Professor of Practice here at Exeter. Ciara is responsible for the design and the curation of the Leading Edge, and I'm going to hand you to Ciara.
Thank you, Jackie. Welcome everyone to the second in our Leading Edge series for 2021, brought to you by the Exeter MBA, and we're delighted you can join us this afternoon for the authority gap, taking women from the margins to the centre with Mary Ann Sieghart. Now, as those of you that have joined us before will know, we want this series to be a space where you as leaders can have the chance to engage with the ideas at the forefront of positive change in business and society. And our carefully chosen speakers have something provocative, interesting, challenging to offer, so that all of you, our MBA students, our alumni, our academic and professional services staff, and our wider business community can gain new perspectives and inspiration for creating a better future. And you're all very welcome this afternoon. This year, we've introduced our Leading Edge conversation sessions where you can stay on after the call to talk with your colleagues and other leaders on the call about the ideas that you've heard. We want to build a leading edge community through these conversation sessions so that we hope you can stay on afterwards for what is a very informal opportunity to share more. Before I introduce Mary Ann, just an outline of how the session this afternoon will run and how you can get involved. Mary Ann will speak for about 30 to 35 minutes, and then we'll open up for questions. But do please put the questions for Mary Ann in the chat as she's speaking, and Jackie and I will pick them up after Mary Ann's presentation and pose as many questions as we can in her time with us this afternoon. Do feel free to tweet. Our hashtag is Leading Edge 2021, and we're recording this session and we'll send you a link in the next couple of days so you can share it with interested friends and colleagues. So on to today's speaker. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Mary Ann Sieghart. Mary Ann has a long and prestigious background and career in journalism and broadcasting. She began her career at the Financial Times before moving on to editorial roles at the Today newspaper, the Times and the Independent, and with columns in many of these papers on current affairs, politics, economics, social affairs and the arts. Mary Ann has also built a high-profile broadcasting career with regular appearances on BBC Question Time, Any Questions, Newsnight, Woman's Hour, and presenting roles on BBC programmes including Start the Week, Profile, and many documentaries. If that wasn't enough, she's a visiting professor at King's College London and currently sits on the boards of the Scott Trust, which is the owner of the Observer and the Guardian, the Merchants Trust, and the Pantheon International. Mary Ann chaired the Social Market Foundation think tank for 10 years and has been a non-executive director of a variety of organisations, including the Ofcom Content Board and the Council of Tate Modern. So Mary Ann, welcome to the Leading Edge and thank you for joining us this afternoon. And I'm going to hand over to you now so you can share with us your thoughts on the authority gap.
Thank you so much. Well, I'm going to start by telling you a story from one of the many really fascinating women whom I interviewed for this book. Mary McAleese, she was President of Ireland and she led an official delegation to the Vatican to meet the Pope, who was John Paul II. And very formal occasion, delegation goes into the audience room, she's at the head of it, Pope comes in to be introduced to her. He walks straight past her, sticks out his hand to her husband instead, and says, "Wouldn't you prefer to be President of Ireland rather than married to the President of Ireland?" Her husband knew better than to take the Pope's hand, and so Mary McAleese grabbed this hand, which was hovering in midair, brought it back to her and said, "Let me introduce myself. My name is Mary McAleese. I'm the President of Ireland, elected by the people of Ireland, whether you like it or whether you don't. However much we say that we believe in gender equality these days, we are still in practice more reluctant to accord authority to women than to men, even when they're presidents or leaders or experts. Every woman has a tale to tell about being patronised, underestimated, interrupted, talked over, having her authority challenged, and generally not taken as seriously as a man. And of course, when I say woman, I mean anyone who presents as a woman. Great strides have been made, things are definitely getting better, and many men are good and respectful listeners. But however liberal we think we are, we're nowhere near there. There is still what I call an authority gap between women and men. And the authority gap is the mother of all gender gaps, because if women aren't taken as seriously as men, they're going to be hired less readily, paid less, promoted less fast, and generally held back in their careers. They're going to feel less confident and less entitled to success. And if we don't do anything about it, the gap between women and men will never disappear. Now, when I put together some slides to give a lecture on this subject at Oxford, I thought, well, first thing I must do is define my terms. So I literally just typed into Google authority definition. And the very first result that came up was the Oxford Online Dictionary. And guess what? Every single example of the use of the word authority began with the same pronoun. So there was he had the absolute authority of one who was used to being obeyed. He hit the ball with authority, and he was an authority on the stock market. I wasn't even looking for this, but I couldn't have found a neater illustration of the way in which we automatically associate male with authority. But didn't Margaret Thatcher have the natural authority of one who was used to being obeyed? Doesn't Emma Raducanu hit the ball with authority? Isn't Helena Morrissey an authority on the stock market? And exactly the same happened when I searched for a slide to illustrate expertise. So I went into Google Images, typed expertise. In the first 20 images, there wasn't a single woman. Bart Simpson appeared before we saw a woman in a group of men. Finally, there was a big image of a woman. I thought, great, I'll use that. I clicked on it. But no, it was a woman having something explained to her by a male expert. Now, I'll give you another example of the authority gap from one of the many women I interviewed for this book, and it was Louise Richardson, who's Vice-Chancellor of the University of Oxford. And she still finds her authority is challenged, despite running what some people think is the best university in the world. So she told me the story about how she was recently presiding at Congregation. Now, Congregation is a bit like the Parliament for the university. Very formal, grand occasion, 350 people, and she literally sits on a throne to preside. So there she was in the middle of a speech when a male subordinate interrupted her and said, "No, you've got it wrong. You should be reading this part." In front of everybody. She said, "Thank you, but actually I've got it right." And she proceeded. The next day she said to him, "I'd just like you to give a little thought to one question. Would you have done that yesterday if I were a male Vice-Chancellor? Would you have interrupted a male VC speaking publicly to a room full of people in a very formal setting to correct what they're saying, especially when this was your first time at the gathering and I'd done it a dozen times?" She said, "I did that mental experiment last night. I'd just like to ask you to do that mental experiment." And this is the mental experiment I'd like us all to do every day, because we might not notice that we're taking women less seriously than men. We might not notice that we listen to them less and we interrupt them more and we challenge their expertise more, but many of us do. And it's not just men who do it, because however progressive and intelligent and even female we are, scientific studies show that we all, women as well as men, have unconscious biases, even against our own gender. And we may not be aware of them. I mean, they're called unconscious for a reason, but they do spill out into our behaviour. And unless we notice and correct for them, we'll continue to assume that a man knows what he's talking about until he proves otherwise, while for a woman, it's all too often the other way around. So to see this more clearly, it often helps to flip things round. If you're a man, try this. Imagine living in a world in which you're routinely patronised by women. Imagine having your views ignored or your expertise frequently challenged by them. Imagine trying to speak up in a meeting only to be talked over by female colleagues. Imagine women subordinates resisting you as a boss, merely because of your gender. And imagine women superiors promoting other women, even if they're less talented than you. Imagine people almost always addressing the woman you're with before you. Imagine writing a book and finding that half the population is reluctant to read it because it's written by a man. Imagine being trolled by women on social media, threatening violence against you merely for expressing an opinion. Not great, is it? But the trouble is that privilege is often invisible, and most men simply fail to notice it. And why would they? I struggle to notice my white privilege sometimes. But in everyday life, it's as if men are swimming in the river with the current, fast current, and they see the banks racing past them and they think, oh, wow, I'm a really good swimmer. And they congratulate themselves. And then they look at women struggling to make headway against the current in the opposite direction. And they think, why can't they swim as fast as me? They're obviously not as good. And that means there is a deep asymmetry. So when I talk to men about this subject, some of them express skepticism. And they say, oh, no, the problem's been solved already. Your thesis is out of date. And if anything, women have been privileged and they're suffering. But that's because they can't see the continuing bias, and we can. They don't experience the myriad little insults to their self-esteem and competence that women have to put up with. And not only is their reaction as wrong-headed as a white person telling a person of colour that racism no longer exists, it actually proves the exact point of this book, which is that women's authority is questioned and challenged, even when they know more than the person they're talking to. Because as you'll see, there is a huge amount of research evidence for the continued existence of the authority gap, and it's resistant to being mansplained away. Now, if a woman thinks that she's being taken less seriously than a man, it's very hard for her to prove that she's the victim of discrimination. Suppose her male colleague gets promoted and she doesn't, he may just be better than her. But there's one very persuasive way of testing this thesis, and that's to talk to people who have lived as both a man and a woman. And because they're exactly the same person, with the same intelligence and ability and personality and experience, and the only thing that's changed is their gender, it's a fantastic way of controlling for all the other variables and isolating the one that really matters, which is gender. Now, I'm going to tell you the story of two science professors at Stanford who happened by coincidence to transition in opposite directions at the same time. Ben Barres, who was a neuroscientist, said, once he started living as a man, I've had the thought a million times, I'm just taken more seriously now. My work's taken more seriously. The same damned work, as he put it, is taken more seriously now. He said, people who don't know I'm transgendered treat me with much more respect. I can even finish a whole sentence without being interrupted by a man, he said. Someone was overheard at the back of one of his seminars who didn't know his history, saying, oh, Ben Barres gave a great seminar today, but then his work's so much better than his sister's. Now, Joan Rothgarden, an evolutionary biologist, she transitioned in the opposite direction and, of course, found exactly the opposite happening to her. She said, you get interrupted, you need to find a male to support what you said and not get offended if a male says the same thing and claims credit for it, because at least you got the message out. That's what you have to navigate. At first, I was amused, she said, after describing how she was much more frequently interrupted and ignored and condescended to by men, particularly those who hadn't known her before. I thought, if women are discriminated against, then I'm darn well going to be discriminated against too. Well, the thrill of that's worn off, I can tell you. Her conclusion? Men are assumed to be competent until proven otherwise, whereas a woman is assumed to be incompetent until she proves otherwise. Unless you think this is anecdotal, sociologists have done studies of much larger numbers of trans men and trans women and have found exactly the same phenomenon. But social psychologists have also replicated the authority gap in proper randomized double-blind trials. So, for instance, one study sent out applications for a lab manager position to top US scientists, male and female. And the application materials were identical, but they were randomly assigned male or female names. And the professors rated the male applicant as significantly more competent and more hireable than the identical female one. They offered him a higher starting salary and more career mentoring. and female professors were just as biased as male ones. In another study, students taking an online course were asked to rate their instructor, who of course they hadn't seen. When they were told the instructor was male, they gave him a higher rating than when they were told the instructor was female, but they were of course the same person. Now, there's no justification for this inbuilt assumption that women are less competent than men. All the way through education, from nursery to PhDs, girls and women outperform boys and men. Yet still women are hired less often, promoted more slowly, and paid less than men, even when they perform just as well. So for every 100 men promoted to manager, which is a position of authority, only 85 women are promoted, and the gap's even larger for women of colour. Yet research shows that women actually make better managers and leaders than men on average. So how does the authority gap manifest itself? Well, being ignored, having your expertise challenged, being underestimated and patronised, being interrupted, being talked over. And this happens even to the most senior and authoritative of women. So, for instance, Amber Rudd, the former cabinet minister, she told me of the male MP who knew of her feminist credentials, asking her, did she know that George Eliot was actually a woman? Michelle Bachelet, former president of Chile, twice, told me she could never conclude a meeting by saying, right, we're going to do A, B, and C, without a male subordinate taking the floor afterwards to give the impression that he was taking the decisions. She was president. A study of US Supreme Court justices, and you don't get much more authoritative than that, found that although women made up a third of the justices, they had to suffer 2/3 of all interruptions. That means they were 4 times more likely to be interrupted than their male colleagues, 96% of the time by men. And this authority gap matters because women tend to be underestimated or underestimated, as I call it, and their views ignored. They find it much harder to influence a group. And I'm sure some of the women on this call have experienced making a point at a meeting or a seminar and having it completely ignored by the other people. And then 10 minutes later, a man makes exactly the same point and it's treated like the second coming. And you think, oh dear, maybe I wasn't articulate enough, or maybe I wasn't confident enough. We beat ourselves up. No, you were just too female. Because one research study put participants into mixed sex groups in order supposedly to decide a child custody case. Deliberately chose that subject because it's actually quite female stereotyped. And they were given lots of information about the family concerned. But a few individuals were given an extra piece of information that the rest of the group didn't have. And when that information was introduced by a man, it was 6 times more likely to be used in the group's deliberations than when it was offered by a woman. 6 times more likely. So the authority gap means women generally have less influence than men. And that matters when you're taking decisions. If you want to make good decisions, you need everyone in the room to have an equal say and an equal amount of influence. So why does this happen? Is it perhaps because men just tend to be more confident when they're talking than women? Shouldn't women just lean in more and be more assertive if they want to be taken seriously? If only it were that simple. Sadly, it's not. It is true that boys and men tend to be more confident than girls and women, which isn't really surprising given all the knocks to her confidence that a woman will suffer as a result of all this authority gap behaviour that I've been talking about. But it's also because of the way we're brought up. So one of the saddest pieces of research I came across was one showing that if you ask British parents to estimate their children's IQ, they will estimate their sons on average to be 115 and their daughters at only 107. Despite the fact that girls develop faster than boys, have a bigger vocabulary than boys at an earlier age, and do much better at school than boys. But still, they think that their boys are cleverer. And boys are bound to, at least subliminally, absorb this feeling, as are girls. So it's not surprising, perhaps, that adult men on average will estimate their IQ at 110 and adult women at only 105, despite the fact that we know that their IQs are, on average, identical. So not only do we bring up our boys to think they're cleverer, even though they're not, we also encourage them to behave quite differently. So girls are taught to be more modest, self-deprecating and quiet than boys. If you watch little boys playing together, it tends to be a sort of boastful competition that they indulge in. You know, oh, my dad's got a better car than yours, or I've scored more goals than you this season. Whereas girls tend to do exactly the opposite. So they bond by saying, oh, I'm useless at maths, or I hate my hair, or my bum's too big. And this continues into adulthood. So as Eric Byrne, who wrote Games People Play, says, men play the mine's bigger than yours game, and women play the mine's smaller than yours one. But if a woman starts to play the mine's bigger than yours game, we really don't like it. So research shows that we punish women who promote themselves while happily accepting men who do. And if a woman does appear as confident and as assertive as a man, quite likely to use adjectives about her such as, oh, she's quite abrasive, or she's strident, or aggressive, or bossy, or overbearing, or even bitchy or ball-breaking. These are words that we never use of men in the same position. So why do women get punished for displaying exactly the same behaviour as men? Well, it's all because of the old-fashioned stereotypes that still lurk in the deepest recesses of our unconscious brains. As social psychologists call it, women are still expected to show communality. In other words, kindness, concern for others, gentleness. They're supposed to be unassuming, uncompetitive, unassertive. While men are expected to show what's known as agency. So men are supposed to be confident and assertive and dominant and showing leadership. And these stereotypes are not just descriptive, but also prescriptive, particularly for women. And so if women start showing agency, as men are supposed to do, and as you have to do in order to be taken seriously, it quite often makes us feel uncomfortable because they're going against stereotype. And as a result, we quite often dislike them. And likability matters more for women than it does for men, because when it comes to hiring and promotion decisions, likability is taken account of much more for women than it is for men, particularly if it's men doing the hiring or promoting. So the only way through this is for women to ladle oodles of warmth over their demeanour. So we have to smile a lot, we have to crack jokes, we have to be incredibly emotionally aware of the effect that we're having on other people and careful to protect the egos of the men around us. It's exhausting, it's often inauthentic, and it really shouldn't be necessary. But still women are often blamed for not being assertive enough. So at the very extreme, we hear people saying that the entire gender pay gap is women's fault, and if only women asked for more money, they'd get it. But actually, research has shown that women do ask for a pay rise just as often as men. They're just not given it. And in fact, women who negotiate are taking a big risk because hirers are more than 5 times more likely to say that they don't want to work with a woman who negotiates than with a man who does. And this bias actually comes entirely from men. Women hirers don't have it. So there is a real double bind for women. If a woman isn't confident or assertive enough, she'll never get anywhere. People won't take her seriously. But if she is, many of us will resist her and dislike her. So there is such a narrow path between being underconfident and therefore disrespected and overconfident and therefore disliked. Navigating that path is a real burden that men just don't have to bear. Now, perhaps because men tend to be more confident and sometimes more entitled, they also talk more than women, particularly in public settings, such as schools, universities, and the workplace. And this too tends to increase their authority compared with the women in the room. Some men indulge in what I call conversational manspreading, just taking up a disproportionate amount of talking time, usually at the expense of women. You may not notice they're doing it, but I bet the women watching this talk have had it happen all too often to them. How many times have you sat next to a man at dinner and he hasn't asked you a single question, but he's banged on for ages about himself? Now, my favourite study about speaking time, because it makes me laugh, gave male and female participants a tape recorder and 3 paintings to look at. And they were asked to talk for as long as they liked about these paintings. The women spoke on average for 3.17 minutes, and the men 13 minutes, in other words, 4 times as long. But even these figures weren't accurate because 3 of the men were still talking when their tapes, which had a recording time of 30 minutes, ran out. And again, this starts in childhood. So Alison Dewey, a Canadian professor, spent 10 months studying a classroom of 7-year-olds and discovered that the boys talked 9 times more than the girls. Why was this? Because boys were being rewarded by teachers for talking, while girls were praised for being quiet and well behaved. So this continues into adulthood. Women are much more likely than men only to speak up if they're absolutely sure of their ground, and they have good reason to do so because they're much more likely to be challenged. Women also suspect that even if they do take up any proportionate conversational space, people will feel that they've talked more. And they're right, because research shows that if a woman has talked for as much as 30% of the time, listeners think that she has dominated the conversation. So, just as with confidence and assertiveness, women have to be very careful not to talk too much. And I use air quotes advisedly because, as we've seen, too much may be just the right amount. Victoria Breskill of the Yale School of Management asked men and women to rate a fictitious CEO who talked more than other people, as CEOs tend to do. And when the CEO was given the name Jennifer, both men and women rated her as much less competent and suited to leadership than when they were told that the talkative CEO was called John. When Jennifer was described as talking less than others, they thought she was much more competent and suited to leadership. So again, women have to learn to talk just enough to be taken seriously, but not so much that they're disapproved of. It's as if we need the agility of an Olympic gymnast on a balance beam to get this right, whereas men can just saunter along the floor. Now, in many of the studies I've cited, though not all, women are just as biased as men. How can this be, you might ask? Well, we've all got these sneaky stereotypes, haven't we? Most of us have grown up in a family in which our fathers have earned more than our mothers, our fathers have perhaps gone out to work more than our mothers, and maybe our fathers have more authority at home than our mothers. And we've all grown up in a world in which men are basically in charge. And so this association of male with authority is hardwired into what you might call our reptilian brains, the parts of our brains that don't think consciously, but think unconsciously. And it comes out in the form of unconscious or implicit bias. When I made a BBC Radio 4 programme about implicit bias, I asked listeners to imagine a hijacker bursting into the cockpit of a plane and attacking the pilot. And then I asked them whether in their imagination the pilot had been male or female, or white male, I guessed. Margaret Oates tweeted afterwards, "Driving home in uniform, this programme asked me to imagine a pilot. Yes, I pictured a white male, in spite of being a female pilot." So that just shows how ingrained our unconscious bias is. And Harvard's implicit association test, which measures how quickly and accurately we're able to associate female and male words with home and career words, shows that this implicit bias is just as strong among the young as the old, among liberals as among conservatives, and among women as among men. This doesn't let men off the hook, though. It just means that we all need to civilize and humanize and bring up to date our reptilian brains. We need to notice when we're underestimating women or when we're having an unfair reaction to a woman doing something that we find perfectly acceptable in a man and then correct for it. And this is all the more important when our gender bias intersects with other biases, such as race, class, sexuality, disability. Each of these differences from the middle-class white male default widens the authority gap. The assumption is that these women will be much less competent than white men. So they suffer treatment ranging from underestimation and disrespect to outright hostility. Black women are more likely than white women to say they feel stalled in their careers and that their talents aren't recognised by their superiors. They're nearly twice as likely as white women to come up against manifestations of the authority gap, such as having to provide more evidence of their competence or finding other people are often surprised at their abilities. And even if they do make it to the top, other people often assume they're a diversity hire and wouldn't have made it on merit. The most disadvantaged of all are disabled women, and they're 19% of women of working age. They're paid less, they find it even harder to progress. And if a woman has a physical disability, people are all too ready to assume that her brain is affected too. So when we're trying to correct for our unconscious bias, we have to be doubly or trebly alert about the intersections that arise thanks to race, class, and disability in particular. Now, most of the bias I've talked about is present in both women and men. But I'm now going to talk about a particular male phenomenon, which is some men not even exposing themselves to women's voices or views in the first place. And if you don't listen to what a woman says or writes, how can you accord her any authority at all? Now, on average, men read 4 books by men for every 1 book by a woman, whereas women read roughly equal numbers of books by both genders. Lisa Jardine and Annie Watkins of Queen Mary University interviewed 100 academics, critics, and writers about their fiction reading, and they found exactly this ratio. And when asked which novel by a woman they had read most recently, the majority of men found it hard to recall or couldn't even answer. When asked to name the most important novel by a woman written in the last 2 years, many men admitted defeat and confessed they had no idea. And these were academics, critics, and writers, not just the general population. When Esquire magazine drew up a list of the 80 best books every man should read, which were described as the greatest works of literature ever published, only 1 was written by a woman, Flannery O'Connor, and she had a gender-neutral first name, so I bet the guys compiling the list thought she was a man. It's the same with movies. So men, for instance, are much less likely to watch, say, Little Women, even though it's a great film and it has 4 strong male characters, while women are quite happy to go along to, say, 1917, which is pretty much entirely populated by men. And we see this on Twitter too. Men are much more likely to follow other men than women on Twitter, and are then much more likely to retweet them or comment on their tweets. And sadly, women don't counteract this bias by disproportionately following or retweeting other women. We also find that men are less likely to invite women to talk at conferences, even when they're just as qualified. Men are less likely to cite women's work in academic articles, even when you control for the prestige of the women's university and her seniority. So these are all examples of women not being listened to by men. And if men aren't even listening to us in the first place, how can they begin to accord us authority? So if you're a man watching this, may I say, first of all, thank you. You're unusual in coming to a talk by a woman and mainly about women. But your commitment will be rewarded, for this part is designed for you. Counterintuitively, perhaps, it's mainly about what you can gain as a man from taking women more seriously and treating them with equal respect. Because there's a huge amount of evidence to show that this is not a zero-sum game, it's a positive-sum game in which everybody wins. And I know that may sound odd and counterintuitive, because isn't gender equality a seesaw in which if one side rises, the other must by definition fall? Well, I don't deny that there may be individual occasions in which, if you're in direct competition with a woman for a job or a promotion and the bias against her is dissolved, you may find that she beats you on merit. But in pretty much every other aspect of your life, including your day-to-day interactions at home and at work, gender equality is likely to make you happier, healthier, and more satisfied. A woman can tell within just a minute or so of meeting a man whether he's genuinely treating her as an equal or is patronizing her and stops listening as soon as she opens her mouth so he can plan what he's going to say next about himself. Why would she be interested in the second type if he clearly thinks he's superior and has no interest in her as a person? Believe me, being sexist is not a good look for a man. But you don't just have to believe me either, because reams of research shows that everyone in a heterosexual family, including the man himself, gains from a man sharing in a more egalitarian partnership. So the woman is likely to be happier and healthier. So are their children, who also display fewer behavioural difficulties and do better at school. But best of all, for these purposes, the men themselves are also much better off. So they are twice as likely to be satisfied with their life. They're half as likely to be depressed, much less likely to get divorced. They tend to drink less, smoke less, take fewer drugs. They sleep better at night. And this is the clincher, they get more frequent and better sex. And this is all proved by academic research. So guys, what's not to like about this? And fathers being more involved with bringing up their children don't just free up women to advance at work, which it does, and it helps to narrow the authority gap, but they also transform attitudes in the next generation. So daughters with dads who do their fair share at home are more likely to follow their career aspirations with more self-esteem and more self-confidence, often in less stereotypical careers. Sons who see their fathers share the authority also have a more egalitarian view of women's and men's roles. And when they become teenagers, they're half as likely to be violent as their friends who have rigid views about masculinity and gender. So if men are happier at home in more gender equal households, how about at work? Well, my observations about sexist men hold just as true in the workplace. If you treat your female colleagues with equal respect and value their competence as highly as men, it's like giving them a happy pill. They'll like you more, work harder for you, be less likely to leave their jobs. And if you're lucky enough to have a female boss, you'll probably find her a better manager, because research shows that people who work for women tend to be more engaged and loyal. And of course, you'll have read all the studies about how more diverse boards and C-suites make better decisions. And companies with more senior women tend to get higher returns on capital. So now I hope I persuaded you that it's in your interest. Let's look at what we can do as individuals to narrow the authority gap. Now, I counted the other day, I've got 140 solutions at the back of my book in the last chapter, and I can't go through them all now. But the reason there are so many solutions is that each individual instance of the authority gap may seem quite small and trivial, very annoying at the time if no one's listening to what you're saying, but it seems quite small. But they roll up like compound interest over the course of a lifetime to create this still large gap between the opportunities and achievements of men and women. And therefore, each solution is going to be small, but cumulatively, I think they can make a huge difference. So I'm just going to give you some examples now, but as I say, there are many more. I think the most important thing is for all of us to accept that however liberal and intelligent and even female we are, we probably do suffer from unconscious bias. We can't stop it. We can't put a lid on it. We don't even need to feel ashamed of it. It's not our fault. But we can recognize that it's based on outdated stereotypes and incorrect assumptions, and then try and correct for it. So, for instance, we can listen as actively and attentively to women as we do to men. We can notice if we interrupt women more than men, and if so, try not to do it. We can notice if we're challenging women more than men, and if so, ask ourselves why. If we're male, we can try to internalize the notion that there is nothing humiliating about accepting a woman's expertise or authority and allowing her views to influence ours. This is really important. We can stop mistaking confidence for competence. They're absolutely not the same thing. So we shouldn't assume that the man with the loudest voice in the room knows what he's talking about. And we shouldn't automatically believe a woman when she's being self-deprecating. Men can call out other men when they're being sexist and tell them it's as unacceptable as racism. And you actually may find you have more male allies than you think when you do this, because research suggests that men overestimate the sexism of other men. We can be careful of the adjectives that come to mind when we see a woman in authority. Do we find her abrasive, strident, bossy, aggressive, or unlikable? And if so, might this be telling us more about ourselves than about her? We can affirm what female colleagues say at meetings. If they're in a minority, they're less than half as likely as men to win approval from the other members, and much more likely to be interrupted. So no wonder they feel less inclined to offer an opinion. If we're chairing a meeting, we can make sure that women are given equal talking time, and if they make a good point, we can say so. We can call out men for either talking too long or interrupting women. If a woman makes a point at a meeting and is ignored, and a man makes the same point later, the chair can remind the meeting that the woman thought of it first. We can note that if a woman chairs a meeting, other women will contribute much more. And if decisions have to be reached by unanimity, so that everybody's opinion matters equally, women will also speak up more. We can reduce bias by evaluating several people at the same time against each other and against a specific set of criteria, and absolutely not hunch or intuition. We can check that we're giving challenging assignments to female as well as male colleagues. So in a business, we can make sure that women get operational roles with P&L responsibility, as well as ones in marketing and HR. We should allow employees of both genders to work flexibly if they want to, and not punish them in career terms if they do. After all, we've learned in the last year and a half that we can be just as productive, if not more so, working at home or during the hours that suit us. We shouldn't penalise female colleagues for being under or over confident. We need to understand they're walking a tightrope that doesn't apply to men. We can be aware that men tend to reward other men more highly at work, And if we're male, we can try to correct for this. So one study compared objective algorithms with human evaluations. And it found that 70% of men rate men more highly for achieving the same goals as women, rising to 75% for men in senior positions. The algorithm rated men and women equally for similar performance, as did other women. We can resist putting women in teams in which they're the only woman or they're vastly outnumbered by men, because they will perform worse, contribute less, speak out less, and feel more anxious. And the men will also behave worse towards them. We can try not to be harsher on women than men when they make mistakes. Research suggests that this often happens, particularly in traditionally male occupations. We can actively encourage women to seek out promotions. Sometimes they're eminently qualified, but don't have enough self-belief. We can think very carefully about what characteristics we expect from men and women when we're promoting or hiring. So often we look only for competence from men, but a whole range of other characteristics as well as competence for women, including likability. So we need to set out the criteria we want the successful candidate to meet in advance, and then judge all applicants against the same criteria. If we're male, we can ask for a female reverse mentor who can help us understand how what we're saying or doing, probably inadvertently, can contribute to the authority gap. We can be aware of the dangers of affinity bias, that's preferring people like us. So if we're male, we can make a point of bringing on a promising junior female colleague rather than instinctively picking a young man. We can keep meticulous track of how women are doing in our organisation compared with men. And we should disaggregate the data to include intersectional factors such as race, class, sexuality, disability, because only if we know the facts can we act on them. We can make sure that managers all the way through the organisation are aware of the disadvantages that women face and are held to account for the success they have in addressing them. We can take gendered words out of our job advertisements, so don't ask for competitive, assertive, or ambitious applicants, let alone a ninja coder who wrestles problems to the ground, true example. We can use blind CVs in application letters so that hiring managers can't tell if they're from a man or a woman. This really helps women's chances. We can make sure there are at least 2 women on the selection panel, because having only one counterintuitively decreases the chance of a woman being hired. And that's because the men think they don't have to worry about diversity, they can delegate it to the woman. And the woman fears that if she champions a female candidate, the men will think that she's being nepotistic. But most importantly, we can treat every single person we meet as an individual and not judge them through a distorted template of dated stereotypes. There's so much more to be said about how to narrow the authority gap. I haven't even started on what parents and teachers and the media can do, and what structural changes we can make in society to allow women the authority they deserve. But I hope I've whetted your appetite and made you think a little about how you as an individual can contribute to making the world a more equal place. We'll all be happier, healthier, and more satisfied with our lives, men as well as women, if you do. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mary Ann. That's a really helpful romp through your book, The Authority Gap. So thank you very much for doing that. Just encouraging everybody on the call to submit their questions to us. So we've got some questions to ask you over the next few minutes, or indeed experiences of the authority gap. We're keen to hear from people on the call in terms of their experiences. But just to kick off, Mary Ann, can you, in your book, you talk about some female leaders and their experience during the pandemic, and particularly people like Jacinta Ardern and so on. Do you think there are different countries or cultures that are further ahead in terms of addressing the authority gap? Or is this a kind of universal picture, do you think?
It is universal in that it happens everywhere, even in the most liberal countries. But I think liberal countries are better, obviously, than less liberal countries. So, you know, Pakistani and Saudi women have a much harder time being heard than Norwegian or American ones. But even in Norway and America, women still come across this problem. And actually, that's why I wanted to write the book, because I think a lot of people think that in, you know, liberal Western countries, this problem has been solved, and it really hasn't. And actually, in some ways, actually, it's just as hard, because when sexism is absolutely overt, when it's baked into a society as it is in, say, some South Asian countries and Middle Eastern countries, at least you know that it's nothing personal against you. It's just the way women are treated in general. But I think a lot of the time when it's covert, you think it's something that you said badly or did badly or weren't as good at as the man next to you. And I'm trying to point out that no, it's just as systemic in Britain and the US as it is in Pakistan or Saudi Arabia. So.
Thank you.
Mary Ann, I'm quite interested in it's systemic, it's structural. So somebody taking up the role of coaching a female manager into a leadership role, is it drop the tone of your voice, put platforms on to be taller and broader? I mean, where do we begin when actually what we're up against here is much bigger than a set of behaviours?
I'd actually quite like men to be coached in this, actually. That would make more of a difference. I mean, what annoys me is the way that women have been blamed for a lot of this problem. So it's women who get sent on assertiveness training courses. I'd like to see men sent on bullshit avoidance courses, frankly, or overconfidence courses. But failing that, yes, I'm sorry to say that lowering the pitch of your voice does help to give you more authority. It's very interesting, actually, that in more egalitarian countries, the average pitch of a woman's voice has fallen quite dramatically over the past few decades, whereas in inegalitarian countries such as Japan, it still remains very high. And I think that's a sign that we understand, at least subconsciously, that having a lower voice gives us more authority. Now, whether that's because we associate male with authority and lower voices tend to be male, I don't know. It's hard to disentangle. There are other things I've read, such as women tend to sit forward in their chairs at meetings to look engaged, whereas men tend to sit back to look sort of, confident and owning the room, and will mistake women sitting forward as being rather sort of tentative and needy, and maybe women should emulate the way men sit. But I mean, isn't it tragic that we just have to pretend to be men in order for men to take us seriously?
So we're going to take a few questions, Mary Ann, from the chat now. People have started to put their questions in, which is great. And a really good one from Helena to kick us off. From now, looking back at your 18-year-old self, what piece of pure gold advice would you give her, she says?
Oh, gosh. Speak out, I think. Don't be hesitant and tentative, because you will definitely be punished for that. You'll be held back. Speak out, but understand that you need warmth as well, because you will immediately become threatening to a lot of men if you do speak out with the same confidence. So tragically, the world being the way it is, you do have to learn to get them to like you as well, but don't hold back.
I think you mentioned before about having the first word in a meeting, so that you kind of get in there early in terms of having that point.
Yes, I mean, I sit on lots of boards, and I do try to make myself go in early in a discussion, because otherwise someone else will make the same point, and then I'll think, why wasn't I confident enough to do that earlier? So yeah, I think getting in early helps. And it sort of establishes yourself as a presence around the table as well.
Yes, lovely.
Also, there's evidence to show that if a woman asks the first question in a Q&A, which I'm glad Helena has done, more women are likely to follow suit. So if I'm ever chairing a Q&A, I will always call on a woman first.
So another question here actually was the first question from Arisha, and this is asking, it's asking, are there any organisations that you're aware of who have successfully practiced this whole thing about equality and challenging the way the norms are across the organisation?
I'm sure there are lots, because lots are interested these days, thank goodness, in equality and diversity and inclusion, and are trying to do it. But I haven't yet come across an organisation that's taken my 140 solutions and tried to enact them. But the book's only been out a couple of months, so there's time.
They are super tips, actually, Mary Ann, so thank you for that. I spent a long time kind of looking through them. There's lots to kind of pick tips beside. Becky's asked in the chat, has the virtual environment for meetings made a difference, do you think, Mary Ann?
It depends how the meetings are chaired. So if the chair says you've got to put your little orange or whatever colour you choose hand up in the corner of the screen in order to be to have the next turn to speak, that's actually very helpful to women, because it means they're going to get called on in order instead of the men being prioritised. And I think it has also helped if the people in the meeting are relatively respectful, that it's harder to interrupt someone on Zoom, because then you can't hear either person, it all goes crazy and people hate it. And so I think you have to wait your turn more. I think that's right. So both of those are very good. I think working flexibly can be incredibly helpful to parents of both genders. But my real worry is that as we go back to hybrid working, I suspect that many more mothers than fathers will choose to work more from home. And then I suspect that their contributions will not be recognised as readily as the men who are going back into the office and schmoozing their superiors and that sort of thing. So I think companies have to be, or organisations have to be incredibly careful to reward, with pay rises and promotions, women who are working from home as well as the guys in the office.
Thank you. I was trying to mute really quickly before that sneeze came. Apologies.
Bless you.
And you're doing incredibly well with the sore throat, so thank you. A question here from Ruth around, there's lots of tips around how we respond to others. Have you got any more advice about what we can do for ourselves? And have you looked at how all of this plays out in a female-dominated workplace?
Yes, female-dominated workplaces on the whole are much easier, certainly when it comes to things like speaking time. And in fact, listening to each other. So in meetings where there are lots of women, they tend to be more collaborative, listen to each other more carefully, affirm each other more. So on the whole, you will find that things are better in female-led and dominated organisations. You do get, I'm sorry to say, the occasional queen bee, who is not very sisterly. She's on the whole outnumbered by sisterly women, but she still does exist. There were more in my generation than the one above, has to be said. I'm sorry, there was something else I was going to say. Was there another point to it? I think there was.
Advice about what we can do for ourselves.
Yes, what we can do for ourselves. I think the best thing is, if you're worried about being labelled difficult if you stand up for yourself, I mean, first thing you can do is stand up for yourself and say, hang on a minute, you just interrupted me, could I please finish? Or if a man makes a point that you made earlier that wasn't acknowledged, you can say, oh, I'm so glad you agree with what I said earlier. But what is better still, actually, and safer for you is to try to recruit allies. So to get someone else at the meeting to say, oh, hang on a minute, I was really interested in what Jackie was saying there. Would you mind letting her finish? Or, oh, I'm so glad you agree with what Jackie said earlier. Because when it comes from an ally, it doesn't sound as aggressive or difficult as when it comes from you, the woman. That's great. If you can't get an ally in the meeting, have a quiet word with whoever chaired the meeting afterwards and ask, I wonder whether you noticed this was happening, and actually it did bother me. Could you perhaps call it out next time, please?
So a slightly related point and a great point from Katie saying, how do we get more women on boards in the long term without just employing that approach to fill quotas? And you sit, as I said in my intro, you sit on a number of boards, Mary Ann. Have you been seeing a trend in this, and what do you think are the solutions to getting more representative boards?
Well, there are definitely more women on boards now, mainly because the government has pretty much mandated it, or has said if you don't go up to, what is it now, 30%, I think, maybe, heading towards 40, we'll end up bringing in legislation. So it's happening because it has to happen. But then what's great is that the boards are really appreciating the women. So to give you one example, one of the boards on which I sit had been all male for 125 years until they recruited, and good for them, they recruited 2 women, because you never want to be the only woman on a board. And so the 2 of us joined and it seemed to work really well. We got on very well with the men. Everyone was very professional, no problem really. And at the end of the year, there was a board evaluation process. And we were asked, what was the biggest challenge in the year and what did we do best and that sort of thing. And the other woman and I didn't even mention the fact that we joined the board. But the men all said uniformly, we were so worried about having women on this board, but it's been really easy. We've been surprised by how incredibly easy it's been. And I sort of thought, well, that's great, but why were you surprised? What were you expecting us to do? You know, jump up on the board table and pole dance or something? So I think a lot of the time boards are hiring women because they have to, and then discovering that actually there really isn't a problem with this at all. And if anything, they're ending up taking better decisions. But the important thing is to keep at it. And the problem is, because of the way we've all been brought up, I think gender equality is like an elastic band. You have to stretch it to get equality. And if you give up, if you let go, it just snaps back to the default. And therefore, even if the government does say, okay, you no longer need a quota, the boards have actually got to make an effort to make sure that they are still hiring women and not just the same old men.
In your book, you list the various things that different parts of society can do, and you mentioned about education, but we have a couple of questions here about children and young girls. How can educators change this situation, and how can we get the parents to support new ways of looking at gender?
Okay, so most teachers have had no training in this whatsoever, which I think is pretty dire. So I would definitely start to do training. I think a lot of teachers assume that they're calling on boys and girls equally in class, and may be surprised to find that they're not. So on average, boys are much more likely to be called to answer questions than girls are. So don't ask for a show of hands, because if you do that, the boys will put up their hand before they even know the answer to the question quite often. And girls, even if they do know the answer, often won't put their hand up. So much better to ask pupils individually to speak. Don't always divide the class between boys and girls and say, right, boys are doing this activity, girls are doing that, or boys come to the front of the class and girls do that. Why always draw attention to the gender differences? Divide them into red and blue groups or something like that. That actually makes a difference. A study showed that makes a difference to the amount of gender stereotyping that goes on. And as for parents, they've got to want to change in the first place, but they can if they start thinking about it. So I now really try hard never to praise the little girl who I meet for her prettiness or for her lovely dress. I will ask her what she liked doing best, or what book has she read recently, or does she enjoy sports or something? Because I wouldn't say to a boy, oh, you're so handsome, or what lovely jeans you're wearing. You know, when you do that, you're basically teaching girls that they're valued for their looks, and boys that they're valued for their achievements. We've got to get out of those sort of habits, I think.
Mary, we've only got 1 minute left, but I just want to ask this last question because I think it's a really important one to finish on, and then we'll wrap this up before we go on to our conversation sessions. But so it's from Zoe, who says, I'm interested in how we ensure disabled women are included, employed and taken seriously. I've recognised disabled men also ignoring disabled women. So if it's an important question, but if you can be fairly brief so we can finish, but I think it's just an important one to finish on.
It really is important. I think probably disabled women have a bigger authority gap than any other subgroup of women. And again, all I can say is be aware of the way that you are treating people, and be particularly aware when women have a disability. And for organisations and employers, keep track of how disabled women are doing in your organisation. And if they're doing less well than able-bodied women, ask yourself if there's any justification for this. And if not, make a real effort to treat them equally, and then to treat women equally to men.
Thank you, Mary Ann. Thank you to everyone for joining us this afternoon. It's been a great session, Mary Ann. Thank you for such a provocative, interesting presentation, and such good questions too from the chat. Our usual plug, there's Mary Ann's book available from all the usual outlets, Waterstones, our local bookshops here in Devon, our university and public libraries. Our next event is on the 15th of November with John Amici, a respected organisational psychologist, best-selling New York Times author and sought-after public speaker. So do join us for John Amici if you can. But thank you to everyone. I'll just hand over to Jackie briefly before we go. But thank you so much, Mary Ann.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's been fun.
Thank you.